welcome to All Things Music, a podcast by the Goa Jazz Academy. We are very excited to have Dan Costa with us. He is an incredible musician, an absolutely fine pianist, and a really wonderful human being, and somebody who I have had the pleasure of getting to know since October last year. And we've been working on trying to bring him to Goa, and we got very close, very close, but it didn't quite pan out, as I'm sure many of you know. But we are going to bring him back. I think Dan has a very special connection with India, and well, here he is. We're listening to prologue of his new album Skyness, which is absolutely fantastic. We're going to listen to a little bit of it over the course of this podcast. So let's dive in. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me, Karan, and congratulations on your wonderful Jazz Academy and the work you've done so far.
Thank you so much for saying so. How have you been spending your last couple of months in isolation?
Well, the lockdown here where I live didn't last a long time, but basically it's been a period where I've been working a lot on teaching as usual, and of course on composing and my new project, the release of my new single with the Brazilian artist Ivan Lins. And of course, my new album, which is bound to come out soon.
Terrific. How is teaching going online?
Teaching is always a wonderful experience. It's great to share our notions with different people who are very interested, of course, in learning new things. I've been working online for many years, so this wasn't new for me. But I'm glad to see that many colleagues of mine are moving in that direction. I think it's a great opportunity to work with people from around the world, from different social and cultural contexts. And of course, as I said before, it's great to share what you know with other people. And there's something very circular and fluid to that.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about your music before we get in, so that our listeners can get a little context of what it is that you play. So I've really enjoyed listening to both albums. They're fantastic. One of the things that really comes across is how well produced they are. Not just aside from the incredible arrangements and the musicality and the people who are playing on them. Could you tell us a little bit about the tune that's coming up, which is Tempo Sentidos?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you very much for your comments. Tempo Sentidos was recorded with one of the founders of Brazilian bossa nova. His name is Roberto Menescal. He was part of the founding members of the style, along with Antonio Carlos Jobim, Vinícius de Moraes, João Gilberto, and other Brazilian legends. And it was great to collaborate with him on this tune. This tune was written in Greece. And it's related. It's a bossa nova, but it also has a philosophical message related to, of course, seizing every moment. Yeah, and this is why it's called tempos sentidos. So heartfelt moments, in a way, if we were to translate it to English.
That's beautiful. Let's take a listen. incredible. What a beautiful tune. I mean, from the point where the bass comes in and the guitar, there's so much space. How do you get a luminary like Roberto Menescal to come and play with you?
Well, thank you very much for your comments. It was great, as I said before, to work with Roberto Menescal. I had already worked with Leila Pinheiro in my first album. She is a fantastic vocalist. I practically grew up listening to a lot of her music. And then she, of course, recorded and worked with Roberto Menescal. So there was a link there. So I wrote to Roberto Menescal on Facebook, which is what happened with most musicians I collaborated with on Facebook or by email. And he replied saying that he would be very happy to do this. And of course, we were in different countries. He was in Brazil. I was here in Europe. So we went in the same studio when we did this. But then I went to Rio de Janeiro. I played at the Blue Notes to present my album, and he, of course, participated. And there's a video on YouTube of us playing this together with the band.
I said, please do send us a link, and I'll put that in the links for the podcast. We'd love to take a look at that.
Yeah, sure, thanks. It's a different version because it's with bass and drums, so it's a more fusion kind of version, different from this one. This one is a bit more spiritual, the one from the album.
So tell us a little bit. Now, you grew up in England, right? Or were you were born there?
Yeah, so I was born in London, yeah, in '89, and I spent my first 8 years there, and then we moved. I lived in the south of France after that, and that's basically where I started to play music and to learn music. And then, of course, I lived in other countries because of my mixed roots, Italian mother, Portuguese father. And then I also ended up living in Brazil when I was studying music, which was, of course, very important for me because I grew up listening to Brazilian music. It's always been a part of me. So I like to say that when I went to Brazil, I found the African side of me because, of course, the melodic side of Brazilian music came especially from Portugal and also from Italy. Portugal because of colonization, and Italy because of the importance of opera
Hmm.
in that historical period. And so basically, yeah. So I was born in England, and in fact, I also ended up going to the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts in the beginning. When I studied there for some time, I took a diploma in modern music. It was a very interesting experience, but I realized that I wished to focus on jazz and especially on my Latin roots.
What made that transition? When did you really sort of get exposed to jazz? I mean, what was that trigger?
So interestingly enough, coming back to Roberto Menescal, which we spoke about before, and this was basically a bit like a dream because, in fact, the first standard that I played was a tune by Roberto Menescal, which will actually be in my upcoming album, uh, which I which I recorded live. And this tune is called O Barquinho. It's called Little Boat. It's also been recorded by Ella Fitzgerald, by great names of jazz. It's considered one of the most important bossa novas, and this was the first jazz standard as such that I recorded, along with "In a Sentimental Mood" by Duke Ellington. Yes, so my connection with jazz was mainly related to Brazilian music. Yeah, as a kid, I listened to Musha, Tom Jobim, and later on, Leila Pinheiro, etc. So that's how I got into jazz, yeah, basically via Brazilian music. First tune that I played was actually a bossa nova, first jazz influenced tune. So basically, I arrived to jazz via Brazilian music, via bossa nova. And this first tune was, of course, O Barquinho by Roberto Menescal, which is also known as A Little Boat in English. It's considered one of the main bossa novas, having been interpreted by great artists such as, for example, Ella Fitzgerald. And the other tune that I played was, of course, In a Sentimental Mood by Duke Ellington. So these were the first two jazz standards as such that I played. And this shows that, of course, my approach to jazz occurred via Brazilian music. And then, of course, I studied jazz at university, and this exposed me to many great artists. So from Keith Jarrett to Brad Meldau, Lee Konitz, Chick Corea, of course, many different artists which I admire.
What I wanted to ask you was the piano your primary instrument? Have you always been a pianist, or were there other instruments that you also explored early in your journey, or through anywhere?
Well, I think perhaps my first instrument was the voice, because before I used to sing, and I still do, but in the shower, not so much on stage. And I like, in fact, the cantabile element of playing the instrument, piano in my case, always playing as if you were singing. I think it's important for me. And of course, the movement to the piano and the focus on piano was basically related to the richness of the instrument, harmony, for example, which is something, of course, the voice can't really do. And this is, I think, the beauty of playing a harmonic instrument such as the piano, is that you have many voices superposed. Yeah, so that's a great feature. So in answer to your question, piano has always been my main instrument as such, but the voice has also been very important as an instrument.
And what about your education in the last few years? I mean, as you've been finding this identity as an independent artist, as someone who's got a definitive sound, let's say it is Brazilian in its being, in its core. What kind of tell us a bit about Brazilian music in particular that you are trying to channel?
So, of course, as you mentioned, Brazil has been very important in the creation of my sound. Um, but of course, there are also other instruments, such as my Portuguese roots, fado, for example. In my second album, there's a tune called Lisbon Skyline, which is inspired by fado. My Italian roots musically are very important. Italian music was very important when I was growing up. And also other influences. Yeah, for example, Spanish flamenco and other world styles have been important. But as far as Brazilian music is concerned, my first album was basically inspired by different Brazilian rhythms. So in other countries, people usually know samba, bossa nova, but Brazil being such a large country and having such a varied cultural landscape, there are many different rhythms. So in this album, I wanted to bring some of the most famous Brazilian rhythms, but which aren't that famous elsewhere. For example, baião, maracatu, which are from northeast Brazil, or chorinho from Rio de Janeiro, like samba and bossa nova, that have been very influential. So in this first album, there were lots of different Brazilian rhythms. In the second album, there was some Brazilian rhythms, but of course the influence was a bit more distant. So as we heard before, Tempos Sentidos with Roberto Menescal, clearly influenced by Bossa Nova, Lume with Nelson Faria, which I believe you have selected to play today, also a Bossa Nova. But for example, in Compelling, which was recorded with the great flutist Teco Cardoso, there is the influence of Baião. So there are, of course, different Brazilian influences in the second album as well.
So let's hear Bio. I really enjoyed this tune. And tell us a little bit about Marco Susano, who you work with.
So Marco Susano has become, like many of these musicians, a great friend of mine, and he performed with me in Rio last year as well. He is one of the most well-known Brazilian percussionists. He plays many different instruments, from alfaia to pandeiro. And here he plays a few instruments that are typical of Baião. So, for example, there's a bumba.
Very interesting. Now, back in the day, we used to have CDs with liner notes, and I was trying to find the liner notes for this tune because there's a great guitar solo. So who played that?
So actually, the liner notes are on my website. You're right; it's not so easy to find, but there's a picture with the lyrics of the only song from this first album, which was sung by Leila Pinheiro. I penned the lyrics, and under the lyrics you can find this information, and also in the different reviews by Downbeat, All About Jazz, they usually write the credits. So the solo, you're right, a beautiful solo was by Ricardo Silveira, who also does a very nice solo in the samba. So Ricardo Silveira is a Brazilian guitarist who was very popular in the United States, especially in the 80s, 90s, early 90s. And he was the co-executive producer of this album in the sense that he helped me to also to reach out to other musicians.
Wonderful. Well, let's take a listen to Bio. Wow, what an ending. For the listeners out there, you should check out Dan Costa's website if you haven't already. And if these albums, both Sweet Três Rios and Skyness are available on Spotify. This album in particular, Sweet Três Rios, am I saying that right, Dan?
In Brazilian Portuguese, it's Switch Três Rios. Yes.
Três Rios uh,
Yeah.
was recorded in 2016 and voted by Downbeat Magazine as one of the best albums of the year. I mean, that's quite an accolade, Dan. And I can see why. I mean, everything, those solos, the arrangement, again, it's just perfect. I'm really falling in love with your music. Um, I want to talk a little bit about your education. I mean, at the end of the day, we are also a school. We have students who are going to be listening to this podcast. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the choices you've made to enable you to be able to put out a album like this. There's been a lot of study. You've had the right sort of mentorship. So maybe let me make this question a little more clear. Talk to us about some of your mentors over the years.
That's an interesting question. When you say mentored, you mean people I've had lessons with, because it's an obscure word, or people that have actually taught me, or influences, idols.
Yeah, well, you
What?
can talk a little bit about some of the people who have given you, I mean, they don't only have to be musicians, but people who have given you the right sort of direction in life to sort of get you to this point.
That's a very, very interesting question. A difficult one to answer because I've had the chance living in many countries and different contexts. I've had the opportunity to meet many, many different people, and it's really difficult to pick one or two people. I think that many of the people I've met throughout the years, even people I've met and spoke to just a few minutes in, even in the Amazon rainforest, for example, have somehow influenced my music. I think everybody has their role, and everybody has their beautiful presence in the universe. So it's very difficult to pinpoint specific people. Of course, I've had, for example, piano teachers in different contexts, in many different schools um, that I've learned at. But I think that listening is very important. So there are many different artists which I've listened to over the years that have also been very influential. Um, and I also think that there are more than human things that also have also been very important. So, for example, the impact of nature, communication with other forms of life, animals, plants, and so I think that this is also really important when you compose, when you write music. I actually think that, in fact, on occasions it can be even more important. I personally feel that sometimes I have, in fact, very often I have more inspiration when I'm far away from my instrument than when I'm actually sitting down playing. Of course, when you're sitting down playing, you play around with chords and with different colors, which is beautiful because um, music is a bit like painting. We have lots of different colors. We have a palette, so to speak. And so that's really important because you play around and you find different solutions. But at the end of the day, when you have a beautiful experience in your life, when you see a beautiful landscape, when you meet a fantastic person or a fantastic living thing, another animal, this is also very inspiring and very important for the music we make and for the decisions that we end up taking.
That's absolutely true. Do you feel that your perspective has changed about music over the last 2 months, owing to what's happening around all over the world? Have you in this downtime, while you've been teaching and doing all these things, found new inspiration?
Well, I live in a place where there is a good harmony between humanity and the more than human world. So this is a philosophical term that was coined by a philosopher called Abraham. And so I think there's a nice harmony because, of course, there's a sea and the sky. Of course, in urban centers, in cities, I know that this is a bit more difficult to find, this kind of balance and harmony. But I think if we look for it, we also find it. Yeah, the sky, for example, is something that unites us all. In fact, this is why my second album is called Skyness, because there are so many differences, but of course the sky is really something that unites us all. It sounds obvious, but it's something that we can't forget. And so in answer to your question, of course, nature has been very inspiring, and also because I live in a place where the lockdown has not been that severe, there was still some contact with the sort of normal life that we're all used to. And of course, the internet really helps to keep in touch with different colleagues and with different musicians. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, because my previous albums were also recorded not online, but with great musicians that I also met online, I think that this was just an opportunity for many people to explore the positive aspects of the online world. Yeah, for those who of course can. I realize that perhaps in some contexts the internet is not so good, yeah, or that even in contexts where it is good, I know that there were lots of broadband issues, but I'm sure that these are things that can be improved
Well,
in the near future.
that's really interesting because the internet is obviously the way of the future, and especially when you record a jazz album, an album where there's improvisation, there are strong arrangements. What's the process of recording an album like that? I mean, for example, Skyness, all of the collaborations were recorded online. Is that correct?
Okay, so the first album was recorded in a studio in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and the second album was not. So when you say online, I suppose you mean one person recorded in one place,
I meant
the other person recorded.
prior.
Yeah, so overdubs. Yeah, so I recorded basically the piano in Italy in Udine, at Arte Suono, and the other musicians recorded their parts where they were. It's a different concept, and I think that these elements that you're talking about of interaction, um, in the case of a trio, might be a bit more difficult in this context, because my second album, Skyness, was basically duos. This worked just fine. Yeah, there was one trio, you played it before with the bassist, but it's a bit different because the aesthetic of Brazilian music is one where, although of course there is a lot of interaction, there are some things which are stable and have to be there. For example, the bass, etc. And so in this case, it's feasible. But for example, the new single I recorded with Ivan Lins was recorded with him in a studio. I'm always for this kind of thing. I think it's, if there's a possibility, it's always good to record with other musicians in the same studio,
Well,
because of what you mentioned before, because of the interaction, of course.
Dan, tell us a little bit about this new single with Ivan Lins. Let's take a listen to it. Let's just take a listen to it, and then we can have a little discussion about it. Okay?
Of course, yeah.
From too much talk to silent touches, sweet touches. We turned our heart to love, then tried it. First time romance. There in the quiet, love learns to dance. We loved, we slept, we left the lights on. The night's gone. When morning finds us caught in life's most sensible trance, turn up the quiet. Love wants to dance. Oh, souls find new life in hearts that are listening like hers. And oh, dreams find young wings in silence, in silence. From too much talk to love and touches, love touches. When pure emotion takes the moment, we take the chance. Turn up the quiet. Love wants to dance. Old souls find new life in hearts that are listening like ours. And old dreams find wings in silence, in silence. From too much talk to love and touches, love touches. When pure emotion takes the moment, we take the chance. Turn up the quiet. Love wants to dance. Love wants to dance. Love wants to dance.
An interview.
Love wants to dance.
That was absolutely fantastic. Dan, can you
Yes.
give us context about Ivan Lins and what his significance is? This is I'm going to put a link to the video, which was beautifully shot in the studio. There's so much interaction between the two of you. Tell us a little bit about Ivan Lins and about this song.
So, Ivan Lins is another great artist, another Brazilian legend. And this song is quite important because it was written with Gilson Perenzeta, another Brazilian musician, and with Paul Williams, who penned the English lyrics. It was first recorded by George Benson, and then it was recorded by many other famous artists such as Sarah Vaughan, Nancy Wilson, Barbra Streisand, Carmen McRae, etc. And
How
it
about
has become a jazz standard. Yeah, and it was really nice to record it with one of the authors, and of course him. Yeah, so he's a legend in Brazil. He's apparently one of the most recorded Brazilian composers after Jobim in the world. And so it was a very nice experience when I wrote to him, and we were discussing which song to record. I was hesitating between this one and Velas. Velas was recorded and produced by Quincy Jones. It's called Velas in English, Velas Içadas in Portuguese, but more or less the same, which means sails. But I really like the message of Love Dance because it's really related to the message of universal love, which I think is quite important nowadays, isn't it, with this coronavirus situation?
Absolutely. So, what about the process of recording this? Where was it done? What did you bring into the studio with you? And how do you prepare for a tune like this?
Okay, so this was recorded in Lisbon, in Portugal, and in February, so shortly before this whole situation. And it was a very nice experience. As you know, I'm a pianist, so I think I can bring a bottle of water if I can, but the grand piano was already there. Of course, a beautiful Steinway piano. I was very happy with it.
Stunning.
And it's funny because I had booked 2 hours and we ended up speaking for an hour and a half, and we just recorded in half an hour. So
Wow.
we did 2 takes, and this was the result. It was a nice experience to meet him and to speak to him. Of course, we have many colleagues in common. He has worked and still works with great musicians. His music has been recorded, for example, by Sting and by other musicians who aren't strictly related to jazz. So it was very nice to get to know him, share experiences. And yes, so I hope that answers your question. And related to, of course, the process of rehearsing, creation, a lot of it has to do with, as I said before, our relationship with the world, with the natural world. And so when I sit down, this is what I think about, especially when I prepare this kind of tune. There is a strong improvised element. It's jazz at the end of the day, but the structure of knowing exactly, how to approach certain aspects, because at the end of the day, this was my arrangement of the song. Because it's a standard, I didn't want to change too many chords, especially because I liked it as it was. Yeah, there's a lot of 2-5-1s there. I wanted to keep the essentials as they were, but in terms of the piano arrangement, there is a specific aspect of the song that I really wanted to bring to the fore, which is Brazilian music. So many versions of this tune are ballads, jazz ballads, and I wanted to emphasize the Brazilian side of it in this version. And in fact, this happens throughout the piece, but especially in the improvised part at the end, where I'm literally playing a samba, comping while he does some scatting with the voice.
Yes. I particularly like the intro to your solo. I think that's something that we're going to transcribe in one of the ensemble studies when we get that going.
Oh,
Um,
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear. Thank you.
yeah, no, I think that's uh, maybe we can have a separate workshop with some of our
Sure.
students, especially our piano students.
Are you going to play it in the 12 keys or,
Oh,
or
we're gonna
just?
have to. That's mandatory here. So great. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about Skyness. I think it's a very both albums are very mature. They have a lot of depth to them. Skyness is particularly different because you can immediately tell it's an album of duo performances. And one of my favorite tunes from the album is Sete Enredos. So
Mhm.
could you talk a little bit about this before we play it?
So Sete Enredos is, of course, Brazilian influenced, but it was written in Granada in Spain. So there is also a flamenco influence, especially harmonically in some parts with the Spanish cadence. So it was very nice to work with Romero Lubambo. So he's a guitarist who also plays with Ivan Lins and Stevie Wonder and other artists. He's a major Brazilian guitarist, and it was really nice to collaborate with him on this. It's called Sete Enredos, which means 7 stories. And this was a bit of an autobiographical tune. It's related to, of course, the day I was born, which is the 7th of April. And that's why it's called Sete Enredos.
Well, let's take a quick listen, then I have a few questions about this absolutely fantastic tune. My question to you was, even though you have Portuguese roots, you have taken a concerted effort to study Brazilian music in both albums. I mean, whether it's Baio, Samba, Bossa Nova, and these are authentic interpretations of this music. So, where does one start that journey? How do you take something that's a study and then turn it into
Well, thank you
something as
for your
beautiful
words.
as this?
I think beyond the Portuguese roots is more to do with the fact that I grew up listening to that music and that I've always felt very connected to that music. As I kind of mentioned before you mentioned this now, the two main roots of Brazilian music are Modinha and Lundum. That's what historians say. And the Lundum is related to the African origin, so the rhythmic side of Brazilian music, and Modinha is related to the Portuguese roots, and with a strong influence from Italy because of the opera, which was very famous at the time. So, of course, these were the main sources of Brazilian music, Lundum and Modinha. But regardless of this, I think I've always felt very connected to Brazilian music because of not just the language, the lyrics, but the different styles and the way it is so rich in many different ways. And so, as a kid, of course, I grew up listening to samba, bossa nova. But then, when I lived in Brazil, as I was studying at the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, so Unicamp in the state of São Paulo, I discovered other rhythms which were also very important for Brazil, like, as I mentioned before, baião, maracatu. And traveling around the country allowed me to discover these rhythms and to delve into them. And of course, there are still rhythms I don't know, and still rhythms that even many Brazilians don't know because it's such a rich country in this respect.
Well, that's absolutely incredible. I mean, even as an Indian, to study Indian music, there are so many varieties, right? You
Of
have
course.
Carnatic, you have Hindustani
And India is
classical.
also very rich musically. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with some local musicians during my previous tour. For example, a colleague of mine who plays the sarod, and it was a really nice experience. I think you have beautiful instruments.
Well, that actually brings me to one of the things that's really special. You have a connection with India in the sense that you've been here, what, 3 times now?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, the last time was a very nice experience because it was a tour. It wasn't a national tour because it was only in the north, but it was still a beautiful experience. So I started off in Delhi, and there were a few performances there, especially in connection with the Brazilian embassy. And I also performed in Kolkata and in Chandigarh. And it was really nice to get to know the cultural differences between different regions, and to interact with many different people. And for me, it was a surprise in the beginning to find out that many people in India don't speak English. And for me, it was surprising in the beginning. But of course, this does not hinder communication in any way. There are, of course, other ways of communicating. As you know, of course, being a musician, this is also a great way to communicate our feelings using other tools. But it was very nice to see the cultural differences, not just in terms of music, but also in terms of food, in terms of architecture, in terms of history. And I know that the lockdown was particularly difficult, wasn't it, for India?
Through and see. The one common factor is that no matter where you are in the world today, everybody has the same problem. And I think we're in a unique time because this also presents an opportunity for us to rethink the way we look at the world,
Definitely.
right? And as you've been studying philosophy and lately, right? I mean, outside of music, you've been educating yourself in other things. Tell us a little bit about that. Now that we're talking
Yes,
about
of course.
worldviews.
Well, I know that you have a strong current of Indian philosophy, but I think I've been focusing more on Western philosophy because of the way studies are structured here. But Indian philosophy is definitely something worth looking into. Over the years, I've always been fascinated by Greek philosophy, and this is one of the reasons why Greece has always been influential, especially in my second album, Skyness, which was conceived in the Cyclades. And of course, philosophy has been important for me in helping me to see things from different viewpoints, which is, I think, fascinating. And recently, of course, I've delved a bit more into that by studying specific philosophers, which are, I think, very influential, such as Aristotle, Plato, and then other European ones such as Hume, Kant, and I think all of them have something incredible to say, especially those related to ecosophy, so ecological philosophy. I kind of touched on them before we mentioned this, because I think they really manage to analyze and to interpret our relationship as human beings with other forms of life, because at the end of the day, we're just a part of the universe. Yeah. So, for example, the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty and Abraham, which I mentioned earlier, and of course Schelling, for example, who had this whole philosophy of nature. I think what they've done is incredible.
What do you see for yourself in the future? I mean, have you given it some thought about what your next steps, maybe not as a performer, but in terms of your music, your journey, your education as a musician?
So
What's
I have
next for you?
an upcoming album, which I touched on earlier, which was recorded live. So I want to keep a bit of suspense, but
Do we get a
very
preview?
soon, very soon. Very soon. And for me, this is an important one because it's my first live album, and which was recorded shortly before the coronavirus. Yeah,
Terrific.
yeah, yes. And it's something that I hadn't really thought about. In fact, I didn't even want to record that show. Somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, can we record it?" And stuff. And I'm not a big fan of recordings, to be honest, because I think, of course, recordings are very important for us. But as you know, as a musician, there is a strong spontaneous element to jazz, where things happen only once. And of course, when you record, that changes the whole paradigm, right? But then, so of course, they recorded it, and I listened to it, and I said, "Oh, it sounds pretty good." So I thought that I might as well release it, especially because of the interaction with the audience. I feel that as musicians, at the end of the day, we're communicating a message, yeah, be it love, happiness, which are things that I cherish, but of course other things, many other things. And so by performing in front of an audience, you have that added element that you don't really have in a studio, which is you have an audience and you're communicating directly to them without any barriers. And I think that's beautiful, and that's why I really wanted to capture this in my upcoming album.
Well, it seems like you've certainly put a lot of thought into it, you know. We're looking forward to this. Please do send us any links and previews that you have when you get them. We're coming towards the end of the hour, and I wanted to ask you before we play our final track, which is Skyness, featuring Seamus Blake.
Yes, I think so.
Right?
Some people say
Seamus Blake?
Seamus, some people say Seamus, but I think that's correct.
Well, he plays really well, so he's and both of you have some great interaction in this tune. Do you have a message for your listeners here? Some of our students, anything before you?
Yeah, I
Before we
think
leave you?
live as much as you can and study based on what you've lived. That's my message.
That's wonderful. We'll just join you in a minute again, Dan. We're going to play Skyness. As with all things that are beautiful in nature, there is beauty in minimalism. And I think that's what this track or this song shows so beautifully. There's so much space and there's so much emotion. I mean, it's hard not to listen to this song and really think about the sky and really think about what's beautiful in this world. Tell us a little bit about this tune.
Well, thank you very much for your words, Karan. This tune was inspired by the Cyclades in Greece as the conception of the album. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been very influential because of the fact that many islands are still quite traditional. So they've kept their soul, they've kept their traditions. You don't see, for example, skyscrapers and things like that. So there is an equilibrium between nature and the human world. And for example, in the colors that I used, blue and white, so you see that everything seems to be connected in a way or another to the sky and the sea. And so this was the inspiration for this tune. But then because I've also been traveling and I've also performed in many different contexts, and as I mentioned earlier, I really feel that the sky does have this unifying element. And so this was the philosophy behind this tune.
Well, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. We're going to put this out on YouTube and also include this in our newsletter. And I hope that we get to actually meet soon.
Yes, I hope so too. Yeah, next year.
It's been just a dream working with Dan. And even though we couldn't bring him here, I know we will in the future. Dan, I want to wish you the best of luck with everything you're doing. And as always, let's stay in touch.
Likewise, and congratulations once again on your school, your initiative podcast. And I think this is one of the best things of India right now is that there are lots of initiatives and lots of jazz projects arising.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Have a wonderful weekend and
okay, cheerio. Thank you.